One way to tell if you're mestizo, Spanish blood and native blood.
Superior blood. As if European DNA is superior in any fucking way, man. And when you yourself probably are less than fucking 30% of it, just judging based off of your profile. I've seen plenty of people stitch you at this point and respond to your videos. And I really implore you to take the time to properly educate yourself on the history, because you just make sweeping statements such as the indigenous peoples were just, only advanced to use bows and arrows, and that's all they were, that they didn't accomplish anything in thousands of years, and that the Europeans were just like these fucking saints and so technologically advanced, which is just ridiculous. But let's tackle this. You first wanted to act like the Spaniards were these noble heroes that came and saved natives, and that, natives were just slaughtering each other, committing human sacrifices, and were morally bankrupt. But the Spanish and Europeans themselves were morally bankrupt people that were just as bad, that just slaughtered tens of thousands of people for no reason. As you can see in this book, Secret Jews by Juan Marcos Bejarano Gutierrez, they slaughtered tens of thousands of Jews, forcibly converted many of them, basically took away their children to forcibly convert them, if possible, and they also expelled them as well. So they did this only 100 or so years prior to the first invasion of the Americas. Not to mention the other Europeans fighting, religious wars all the time, killing each other because they didn't follow the same faith, burning women because they thought that they were witches, and they were completely ridiculous to even think. Regarding your claim that indigenous people didn't accomplish anything for thousands of years, and that they only just had bows and arrows, and were these people that were primitive, is completely far from reality, and it just goes to show how ignorant you really are. I implore you to read Fifth Son by Camilla Townsend, because the infrastructure that you found in central Mexico at the time definitely beat out any of the largest European cities at the time. The Spaniards completely marveled at the infrastructure, at how advanced the indigenous people were, and that was down there with the Mexica or the Aztecs. One of them even remarked how after the whole conquest period, how they had destroyed the city to that degree that he felt extremely regretful that he was moved to tears, and he wrote a letter about that. Regarding your claim that most Mexican culture is derived from Spanish or European culture, that is completely false. If you read the book Mexico Profundo by Guillermo Bonfil Batalla, he was a leading Mexican anthropologist in the late 1980s. He purports how the vast majority of the culture comes from the indigenous roots, and that Mexico is a de-Indianized nation. You oversimplify the conflict between the Spanish and the indigenous people to just the showdown with the Mexica, in central Mexico, where the whole war period ended after a few years, and you imply that the indigenous people were inferior because they lost after a few years, without really examining all the factors. But even so, without that, you really reduce this down to such a simple black and white narrative that I see so many other people do, as if the showdown down in central Mexico was what decided the fate of the rest of the Americas, when it certainly did not. Right after that, the Spanish were embroiled in a war with the Chichimecas for 50 to 60 years, and they couldn't defeat them militarily despite having, horses, gunpowder, and armor. They still could not contend with those warriors because they were that skilled and because they had better tactics. And so at the time, they had to sue for peace after 50 years of fighting. These supposedly superior Spaniards that were just so gallant and brave and amazing, right? They couldn't hack it. This is from the viceroy at the time, Martin Enriquez, saying that the Chichimecas still remained to be conquered and that all the Spaniards of New Spain would not suffice for the task, right? And this was in a letter to his successor in 1580. And you could read more about that in Soldiers, Indians, and Silver by Philip Wayne Powell. Now, I've run into Hispanistas plenty of times before, so I know the type of rebuttals that you guys say, which is simply, you hate your Spanish roots, you hate your European roots, blah, 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 blah. And that is not certainly the case, so please spare me that bullshit. Because I have traced my European roots extensively. I've applied for Portuguese citizenship. I speak Spanish to a nearly C2 level. I improved it. I speak Portuguese fluently. So I'm much more connected to any Iberian roots than you would be, right, on that basis. So, don't try to punch up when you can't. But let's not be disingenuous and ignorant, and let's not pretend that Iberians were these gallant saviors that were morally justified in coming here and doing the things that they did. You ask, where would the indigenous people be without the Europeans coming here and having invaded and colonized everything? They would just still be very primitive. And to that I say, well, where would the rest of the world be if it wasn't for trade? If it wasn't for adopting different technologies, because that's exactly what the Europeans did to the Chinese and different types of nations in the past. And that's how technology is spread across the entire world. So what would have happened essentially without invasion or colonization is that the indigenous people would have developed even more by themselves. They would have developed different type of tech because they already had different tech that the Europeans didn't have at the time, different methods, and they would have acquired everything else through trade, through diplomacy. So it wasn't necessary to have a bunch of violent colonization, rapings and killings and genocide for them to develop. That would have naturally happened. That would have naturally have happened. And additionally, I find it funny that a lot of the times when Hispanistas go into this whole thing and they talk about this matter, they typically are Christian themselves. They really talk about how important that is to them. And yet nothing in the Bible would support what the Spanish did when they came here and colonized everything and how violent they were. And I guarantee you, if there is any validity to, let's say, the Christian religion, I'm not really religious myself, but let's say it's true, right? If it's true, then those people that did those actions wouldn't be in heaven.